This is Oral History Program once again. I'm Ray Mofield. And for WCBL, we're visiting today at 213 West 12th Street here in Benton at the home of Willie Mofield. Thank you very much for letting us come.
Well, thank you for coming.
Now, I understand that, Miss Fields, you were not born in Marshall County, but some of your grandparents were, and you've lived here for soon be 69 years.
Yes, that's
So
right.
we'd say that you're eligible for the program. Now, where were you born?
I was born in Waxahachie, Texas. My grandfather and grandmother raised us. They were born here and married here, and they went to Texas when they were first married, and all of my aunts and my mother was born there in Texas. And my father died before I was born, and my mother died when I was about 7 years old. So we lived with my grandfather after that, and he moved on out to West Texas. And my mother lived with her for about 4 years, and then she married again and lived about 2 years before she passed away. And we lived a while with my stepfather, but he didn't want to be bothered with 4 or 5 brats.
Yeah.
So my grandfather was out in West Texas, and he came out in a covered wagon and got
In a covered wagon?
in a covered wagon, yes. And we went from Fisher County out to Pecos County in a covered wagon. It took us about 3 days and nights. And we lived out there about 3 years.
You yourself, did you ever ride in a covered wagon?
Yes, yes. We all rode in the covered wagon, and it took us about 3 days. And we went out to Pecos County, and we lived out there maybe 3 or 4 years, and then we came back to Fisher County. My mother had a farm in Fisher County, and we came back there.
Mm-hmm.
And after all of the people was gone from home except me, my grandfather and grandmother decided to come back to Kentucky. So they came back to Kentucky in 1917, and I came with them. And they stayed out here 2 years, and then I got married, and they went back and left me here. So I'm...
About how old were you when you came to Marshall County?
I was 16.
16 years old. So you had already had the experiences that I usually ask people about, one-room school or something. Where did you go to school?
Well, when we were out in West Texas, it was scarcely populated. So my aunt got permission to teach we 5 children and one of the neighbor's children. So she taught us 1 year. And then we moved up about 20 or 30 miles from there, and they had a small schoolhouse there. So we went to school there. And then when we went back to Fisher County, we had a very nice school, but it was just one big room, but it had a curtain. It was 2-room schoolhouse.
Yeah.
So that's where I went. And
You know, I was at church Tuesday night at Calvert City at a youth meeting, and there was a man visiting there, and I happened to sit down by him, and he told me his name, which I have already forgotten, but he said, I'm from Muleshoe, Texas. Well, I knew that is true because I'd been through Muleshoe. I knew it was on Highway 84, and I told him that, and he about fainted that I had heard of it. Now, 2 or 3 people nearby said, I know this is a joke. There's no such place as Muleshoe.
well, there is. I don't know where it is, but I've heard of it.
Well, it's not far from Palestine.
Well, I don't know where Palestine is, of course.
Deaf Smith County. Do you?
Well, see, I left Texas when I was 17, and I don't know a lot about Texas.
They have some unusual names here
Yeah,
and
they
there.
sure do. We've just been to Texas to a family reunion, and we talked about the names of the different places that we went out, but still we found names like we have here. Like we were close to Nashville, and we was close to Fulton, and we was close to Clarksville and different places like
Paducah?
that, but they do have...
The only other Paducah in America is in Texas.
well, I didn't know about that.
There are just 2 of them.
I just had 1.5 years of high school. I never did graduate from high school.
Well, very good. And you came back then when you were 16 years old, and you married shortly after that. Now, how did you meet your husband?
Oh, we lived about a half a mile of my husband's brother, and his wife was related to my grandmother. And we were real good friends and real close, and he came to visit, and that's the way I met him.
Mm-hmm.
And
So he was a Marshall County
yes, he was a Marshall County one.
and lived here, I guess, about all of his life.
Well, yes, I think so.
Did you ever run off to Detroit and work?
No, he went up to Detroit and got a job and stayed 3 days and then come back home. But we never did leave Marshall County after we married.
Yeah.
We came here. My grandfather was, everybody back here called him Uncle Jim Ellis because he was an uncle to everybody back here. And my grandmother was a Cross. And
Well,
she,
now that puts you in pretty good company with the Crosses, and
we have a lot of distant relations here. Of course, my grandfather.
maybe Joe Cross Creason.
Yes.
Street's right over there near you.
Yeah, Joe Cross Creason's grandfather was a known cousin to my mother.
Mm-hmm. Well, very, very interesting. Now, what did you begin to do to earn a living? I know when I first knew you, you were in the florist shop.
Well, I didn't do anything much. Of course, I had a big family. See, I had 7 children, and I had a big job.
Well,
Doing things at home.
with 7 children, you had a handful.
But after they got up a little bit bigger.
Now, before we get away from this, I'd like to hear a little bit more about your grandfather. The one on your father's side, was he in Civil War?
Yes, sir. He was killed in the Civil War. He was just 37 years old.
And this is his photograph right here.
That's his photograph. And he left a wife and 3 children. My father was one of them, and he had 2 sisters.
Uh-huh.
And they were from North Carolina. And I don't know how they got down to Texas, but anyway, they were
Well,
down
of course,
to
the
Texas.
story of America pretty much is moving west.
That's right.
From the time they settled at Jamestown in 1607, people started moving to the central part of Virginia, and then the western part of Virginia, and then Kentucky, and finally on, of course, to Texas and all the way out to California.
But
So-
my grandmother never was happy after she left Kentucky. I mean, just real happy. She always longed to come back to Kentucky. And they finally came, but my grandfather thought he had to work too hard. Out here, he said it was much harder farming out here than it was in Texas. So he just stayed 2 years and went back.
Well, I guess he probably was growing tobacco, and that's an awfully hard
Yes.
crop.
He had a tobacco crop.
I remember growing that stuff. Did you ever try to sucker it?
Yes, I worked in tobacco one year.
Gum got all over your arms.
Yeah, that's right. My grandfather came out here in February, and he bought a home up here close to old Wadesboro, but it was rented for that year. So we rented a log cabin from Kurt Knowles up here in the country, and we lived that year in a log cabin. And my grandmother borrowed one of these skillets that sets up on legs, and she did a lot of our cooking in the wintertime. She did all of our cooking in that.
Sort of a Dutch oven.
A Dutch oven, and it was really good. She'd bake potatoes, sweet potatoes, and Irish potatoes. She'd make biscuits and just cook meat in that old skillet, and it was really good.
Yeah, I can remember going to my great-grandmother, Hal Edwards' wife, and she liked to cook on the fireplace. She died in 1940, I believe, at the age of 88, so you know it, she was an old-timer. And I thought that was the best food I ever ate in my life.
It was delicious. You just never get anything like that today.
Let me ask you, do you think cooking on a wood stove was better than what we do today? My mother
Well-
used to think she could bake better biscuits and better cornbread on a wood stove.
Well, I used to be a good cook, and I'm not anymore. I don't know whether the stove has anything to do with it or not. But I'm glad we have electricity and buttons to punch.
Well, we wired the old farmhouse in 1947. They turned the power on August the 7th, I believe it was. And Mother had said, now I don't want anything but lights, an iron, and a refrigerator. Now it got pretty hot ironing in
sure
July and August when you had to crank up a wood stove, and the temperature is already 100, and you made it about 120, I guess. But so we got that, and then the next year I said, well, Mother, I'm going to buy you an electric range. She said, oh, I don't want an electric range, and it wouldn't cook like a wood stove. And I guess many of the older ladies thought they wouldn't cook as well.
Well, the first stove I had besides a wood stove was some company came to town and was selling gas stoves, and one of my sons bought me one. And he said, now, Mother, I'm going to take this old stove out in the backyard and take a hammer and tear it up. Said, if I don't, you'll have it back in. But I didn't. I was always glad to have the better stove. But I don't know that they cook any better than the old stoves. I'm sure they didn't, but
they did cook well, but I'll tell you, it was a job to keep them going.
That's right.
And in the summer, oh, that was hot.
Oh, and all the ironing you had to do and build up a fire. And
Did you, you had 7 children, and you ironed with those old sad irons that you...
I sure did, and I washed on the rub board.
Yeah.
After my children got, well, the smallest one wasn't big enough, but the big ones got old enough to take care of the smaller ones. I went to work then. I worked at Thomas Morgan's department store for years. And then I went to work later for the lady that owned the flower shop here, and I worked for her a couple of years, and then I bought her out, and that's about 54, I think.
Now,
and I've been in
was Thomas Morgan's store always about where it...
It's where Morgan's is now, and then they had a sort of a dime store next door where Peel and Holland is. At the time, I didn't work. He put me in the dime store once, and I worked there about 2 days, and I told him I couldn't take it. There's too much running around, so I went back to the department store, and I worked for him several years.
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about Benton. Can you sort of describe it when you came here in, say, early 20s, late teens? What was around the square?
Well,
Margaret Heath's dad was in a store.
Yes, he had a store there on the corner, Morgan and Heath. Now, we lived at Brownsburg then. When I married, we lived at Birmingham 3 years, and then we moved to Brownsburg, and I stayed there 12 years.
Oh, did you see the pictures in the paper about Birmingham this week? There's a...
My time's out to the paper.
Well, we'll have to get you a copy.
Yeah.
But it shows, I guess, 5 or 6 different pictures. I believe Ernie Collins got the pictures up, and somebody else supplied part of the story. But it showed, maybe a showboat on the river.
Used to, the boats would come down the river, and they'd load tobacco hogs there, and they'd always put on a show, and we'd always go to the show there, and it was very interesting. A lot of people come from Benton over there to show Mr. and Mr. Vathan, Mr. and Ms. Jones, and a lot of people that my husband knew real well. And we'd always go to the shows over there. They were...
Now, when those showboats were coming, I don't suppose there was any regular theater operating in Benton, was there?
No, there wasn't anything. The first I remember of Benton was coming to First Monday and Big Singing Day. I always enjoyed big singing. My grandmother used to sing those good old songs, and she'd always churn, keep time with the singing, you know, and I really enjoy them. I never miss one anymore.
I have my mother's churn. It brings back a lot of memories. I know when she was making me churn, I didn't enjoy it so much.
Well, that's right. I don't remember grandmother ever making us churn. Seemed like she always churned.
Oh, Mother'd put me to churning, and of course she'd be peeling apples or something or other that she was canning or cooking, Or maybe she had washed and was ironing or whatever, and she'd make me churn. And I was wanting to read.
Yeah.
And when it barely start gathering a little butter around where the dasher came through, I'd say, Mother, the butter's already come. She'd look at it, you get to churning. That hasn't gathered yet. So.
No, it had to get to a certain stage before you could take it up.
Yeah.
I don't suppose I would have mind churning. It seemed like I used to want to churn when she'd be churning, but she just never did ask us to. And we
Did you
never
ever put the butter in a mold?
Yes.
They had
My grandmother had a mold that had an acorn and a leaf on it.
Mm-hmm. They were made out of old maple hardwood or
Wood,
something of that kind. And as you say, when you pressed the butter in there and took it off, it left a design.
Design of some kind.
Maybe an acorn or
My grandmother
grapes
had,
or whatever.
Yeah, I've seen different ones. My grandmother had one that had an acorn and a leaf on it.
Mm-hmm.
And I always remember that.
Well, let's get back to some other things that were around the square. Now, I don't know when the first theater came to Benton, but I do recall that Shelby McCallum came here to manage a theater about 39. And that was Crescent Amusement Company. It was over on that corner where Philbeck and Can is, wasn't it?
No, I thought it was over here on the corner where, this other corner over this way.
Well, maybe it
Used to
was.
be. I think
But
it
I
did.
thought it was in that building next to Philbeck and Can, but I'm probably wrong.
I don't remember
about
it being there. When I remember it, it was over. Yes, I believe it was at one time over there.
that. All right. Well, you said you worked in this floral shop for a while, and then you must have been rather saving with your money because you were
I
able
worked
to
there
buy
for
it.
2 years for 50 cents an hour.
And yet you were
did.
still able to purchase it.
Well, I borrowed every penny that I bought it with
Uh-huh.
and went into it just not knowing whether I could do anything or not, but I did. My son-in-law went in with me for a year or so, and then I bought him out.
Mhm.
I run it for about 18, 20 years. Then I sold out, and I've been into flowers some way ever since.
Mm-hmm.
I've retired so many times, and I'm fixing to retire again.
You mean you're still working?
I'm still working. I work about, maybe 20 hours a week, 18 or 20.
Now you're working where?
I'm working at the IGA
Mhm.
supermarket. We have just a little corner of silk flowers there. But I'm training a girl now to take my place, and when she learns, I'm going to quit.
Well, does Walker Myers' widow work out there? I don't know what she would be in, but it.
No, she doesn't work.
Uh-huh.
Didn't she used to work at Morgan's?
Well, she may have.
I think she did. I think she's at the cash register at Morgan's for years.
Mm-hmm.
But she's not. I'm the only old person that works down there.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some of your children for a minute, and then maybe you have some grandchildren. We better get
I have
them mentioned.
I have
here.
about 20 grandchildren, and I have 8 great-grandchildren. But I have 7 children. My oldest son is Marvin, and he lives in Houston, Texas. He's
Now,
just been home last
I
week.
met him, sometime or other. I went with Rayburn Watkins to the Benton reunion. I believe it was the classes of 38, 39, 40, and 41 along in there. And they met at Holiday, and he got up and made a speech. I remember that.
Yeah.
And he was one of the funniest fellows I've ever heard.
He is. He really is. He's just been home. And he worked for GMAC for 31 years.
So he's retired.
Well, he's gone back to work. He's laid off about 6 months. And
He's following in Mother's
But he's
footsteps.
thinking about retiring again.
Yeah.
And next my oldest son is Bob, and he's a painter.
Mhm.
And he is the only one that took after his daddy. His daddy was a painter, you know.
Mhm.
And he lives at Brookport, just across the river from Paducah. And then my son Joe, you know Joe Field.
Oh, yes, I know him. He was the mail carrier and
Yes.
school board member and I don't know what all, but
Yeah. Well, he's still with the education department of the Kentucky.
uh-huh.
I don't know what his,
So he retired and then took another job. Well, I believe they're all doing exactly what you did.
and then Bill, my son lives here, he's cop.
He's a
Yeah.
Benton city policeman.
That's And then I have 3 girls. My oldest girl's Mary Lou Levan, and she and her husband teach school, but they own the Shamrock Motel, and their
Motel.
son now is running it. And then Laura is Laura McDougal.
Mhm.
Her husband's a car dealer, and she deals in cars about as much as he does. And then my baby Dorothy lives here in town.
Mm-hmm.
And she works at Fisher Price, and her husband's a woodworker. He works
Yeah.
in wood.
Mhm.
And I'm proud of all of them.
Now, you said you had how many grandchildren?
About 20. The last time I counted.
And a good many of them live around here, so you can enjoy them.
Yes, most of them do. Marvin's the only one that lives off, and he just has one son. And then I have 8 grandchildren.
8 great-grandchildren.
And they all live around here.
Well, for an orphan who had, I guess, a pretty hard time in early life, you've seemed to do quite well, and
Well,
I
there
imagine
was
you're
5 of
happy
us
now.
children, and our mother and father both died young, but we all lived to be old. Now, my brother passed away about 6 years ago, and he's just older than I am. I'm the youngest. And then I had a sister to pass away in February, and then I have 2 sisters living.
Mhm.
One of them's 91, and the other's about 89. But they're both in homes,
Mhm.
care centers.
Did you evidently liked the flower business? You sort of stayed in it. How did you ever? Did you buy books and read about it? Or?
Well, no, I went to work at this flower shop because the lady didn't know anybody in Benton, and she wanted somebody that knew the people and could answer the phone and do such as that. Well, when they called, I didn't know what they could get for $5 or 10. Of course, you could buy $5 flowers back then.
Yes.
So she'd have to come to the telephone. I'd just pick up her work. I worked for her about 2 years,
Mhm.
and then they left here, and I bought them out.
So in that 2 years, you'd learned enough that you were able to manage it and
Well, I've managed somehow
carry
ever
right
since.
on and do well.
Well, I've done all right.
Mhm.
I don't have any complaints. Of course, I've worked hard.
Yeah.
And I like to meet the people.
Uh-huh.
That's one reason I like to have a job, is I just like to be among people.
Well, tell us how Benton has changed. I mean, anything you can think of, like our church services about the way they used to be, or...
Well, of course, all of our churches are larger and nicer than they used to be. And we have so many more nice homes than we used to have. I reckon people has more money now than they used to. And it's changed a lot. And in a way, we've changed along with it, I guess, and you don't notice it so much.
When you came to Benton, there were not any paved streets, were there?
I don't remember.
At least
yeah.
when you moved in 1917, I think someone told me that they believed they started paving the streets about 29.
Well, see, I lived at Birmingham 3 years after I married, and then I moved to Brownsburg and lived there 12 years before we moved to Benton.
Mhm.
And I can't remember for sure. I don't remember them paving the streets after we moved here, but they may have.
Well, a good many of the towns put in quite a number of their paved streets during the WPA days.
Yeah.
I know Murray did,
Well,
1934.
I know they
35.
did that, but I think maybe the main streets may have been
Mhm.
paved or gravel good. They were pretty good streets.
Well, they paved the road from Benton to Murray in 1933. I remember that.
But I lived over here several years before we had lights in the house and water.
Yes. Well, that's been improved.
Well, it sure has.
And I'm glad it has. of
Well, I am
course.
too. I'm always glad we have these buttons to push. A lot of people longs for the good old days, but I don't.
Well, I don't know. Some things were good about them, I'm sure.
Oh, yes, they
Uh,
were.
Well, do you notice any difference, let's say, in some people tell me, say, well, we're not neighbors with one another like we used to be.
Well, we're not. Now, we used to visit each other, and anybody that's sick, we visited them, and if we could do anything for them. And I've been with the doctors when they had babies and helped see after the mothers and things like that, but they don't do that anymore.
You
But
know?
everywhere I've ever lived, I've had good neighbors because I know they're there and they're willing to do for me. And if I needed anybody, any of my neighbors, I wouldn't mind calling on them.
Mhm.
And I've had them to call up and I'd move into the neighborhood and tell me, now we don't just visit, but now we're here and if you ever need me, why, call me. And I've always felt that way. And I have called on people a time or two when I needed them. And I've had people to call on me and I was always glad to help them.
Have you ever used asafoetida?
No, now my grandmother sort of used asafoetida some, but I never did. I knew about it, but I don't remember any of us ever using it.
But
but
that
I-
wasn't what kept you alive for 85 years then.
No, I don't know what kept me alive. Because Lord, I guess.
Yeah.
But when I was young, I was kind of spindly, weakly thing,
Mhm.
and I never did gain any weight till I was about 42 years old. I was
Well, we
always real
only
thin.
have about a minute and a half left. Do you have some favorite story you could tell us? Or
Well, right offhand, I can't think of anything right now.
you don't have life's most embarrassing moment or any of those things like
No, really, I don't.
Art Linkletter used to get people to tell about what their most embarrassing moment was.
Well, if I had time to think, I might think of something, but right now I don't.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking with you and learning more about you, and that you'd ridden in a covered wagon, and,
Yeah.
born in Texas, but came back to your Kentucky forebears
Yeah.
home, and you've been here longer than most people
That's right.
as a Marshall County. And it's been a real joy, and I thank you very much for allowing me to come by.
Well, thank you for coming. I've enjoyed talking to you.
This is Ray Mofield and the Oral History Program. We've been visiting today in the home of Willie Mayfields at 213 West 12th here in Benton. We return you now to our studio.